Maya Chakravorty is a CFD Consortium for Faculty Diversity postdoctoral fellow in classics at Bowdoin College. She holds a BA in classics and classical civilizations from the University of Toronto and a PhD in classical studies from Boston University. Her research interests include, but are certainly not limited to, early and imperial Latin literature, exemplarity, rhetoric and oratory, Roman historiography, cultural history, and ancient education. Her current book project examines the transmission of virtues and ways in which imperial-era writers conceptualized Republican Roman heroes and ethical discourse, with a focus on the works of Silius Italicus, Quintilian, Pliny the Younger, and Juvenal. Maya has also given recent papers on Silius Italicus's Punica and Livy's Ab Urbe Condita. And then next we have Caitlin, who is a member of the Nisijawea Sikh Cree Nation located in northern Manitoba, Canada. She currently resides on Treaty 1 territory just outside of Winnipeg, Manitoba, and she obtained her BAH in Classics from the University of Winnipeg and an MPhil in Classics from Trinity College, Dublin. She currently works for the Southern Chiefs Organization as a researcher on the Residential School Research Project, which aims to help survivors and intergenerational survivors locate and obtain records related to residential schools, sanatoria, Indian hospitals, day schools, and much more. So please join me in welcoming them both, Maya and Caitlin, for their paper entitled Then and Now, Pedagogies of Ancient and Modern Indigeneity in Classics.
Thank you so much for having us. I will just share the screen so that we can get this presentation started. Can everyone see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So yes, no, thank you for that kind introduction and for having us today. I also want to extend a big thank you to my co-presenter, Caitlin, who has just been so generous with her time guest lecturing for my class, not once, but twice, and just for, helping me as I kind of learned to teach this class. So definitely a big thank you to my co-presenter. Before we get started, I do want to issue a content warning for mentions of colonialism, imperialism, sexual and physical violence, abduction, and murder. And today, my co-presenter Caitlin and I will be discussing our experiences developing, teaching, and guest lecturing for the class titled Then and Now, The Erasure of Indigenous Voices, as non-Indigenous and Indigenous classicists, respectively. This paper, seeks to help scholars interested in teaching indigeneity in the classics generate syllabi, lesson plans, assessments, and bibliographies. We will emphasize the necessity of consulting and collaborating with Indigenous scholars and incorporating their scholarship throughout the class, as well as share the successes and challenges of the first full iteration of the course. Now, the past decade has seen an increased interest in indigeneity and the classics. Most recently, the volume Empires and Indigenous Peoples, Comparing Ancient Roman and North American Experiences, edited by Michael Maas and Faye A. Yarborough, compares and contrasts the role of imperialism in both ancient Rome and early North America. Craig Williams from the Classics Department at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign has produced considerable scholarship on the Indigenous reception of classical literature, and his current research project examines the ways in which over 80 Indigenous authors interact with Greco-Roman culture and literature. A post by Catherine Blouin on everyday Orientalism gives guidance on how to teach classics courses on Indigenous land, as well as providing a sample syllabus for a class titled Sprung from the Earth, Indigeneity and the Classics, offered by the Classics Department at the University of Toronto. Finally, the 2024 Society for Classical Studies annual meeting had a panel hosted by the Mountaintop Coalition, featuring my co-presenter Caitlin, and in fact presided over by our fellow panelist Tara Wells, called Indigenous Perspectives, Ancient and Modern, which highlights the work of classical scholars of Indigenous descent. Now, let me begin with a brief description of the course, which you can see here, and then I will explain each of the 3 modules in more detail. Through comparative study, this class explores the effects of imperialism and colonialism on Indigenous peoples. Using a variety of ancient Greek and Latin literary sources translated into English, students examined how ancient Italic peoples, specifically the Sabines and Etruscans, were forcibly assimilated into the rapidly expanding Roman Republic. Students were also introduced to Indigenous communities currently living along the stretch of British Columbia's Highway 16, known as the Highway of Tears, where dozens of Indigenous women have been reported missing and or murdered over the past 5 decades. Using ancient and modern cases, students examined the impact of colonialism and imperialism upon the cultures of Indigenous peoples, as well as their sense of identity, and researched what, if any, remaining traces of their voices can be found in the study of both ancient and contemporary history. So the first question is, why this class? Briefly, I try to design and teach classes which present a balanced and nuanced view of the ancient Mediterranean world. This is particularly important to me because my research primarily focuses on elite aristocratic members of Roman society. Now, why the focus on the Highway of Tears? Well, I completed my undergraduate degree in Canada at the University of Toronto, and I have strong personal connections to the province of British Columbia. When living in Canada, I had numerous conversations with friends and colleagues about the legacy of the residential school system, modern treaty negotiations, and the increased awareness of the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, known as MMIWG, in both Canada and the US. As a Latinist and a Roman cultural historian, I noticed parallels with ancient Rome, whose imperial ambitions resulted in the forcible assimilation of many Indigenous peoples throughout the broader Mediterranean. The first iteration of this class was a freshman writing seminar offered by Boston University's writing program. However, today, I will be focusing on the version which I taught in the fall 2024 semester at Bowdoin College, which was an introductory classics seminar, although it was not limited to freshmen. I divided the course into 3 modules, seen here, beginning with an introduction to themes, concepts, and methodologies. Next was the Highway of Tears, and the final module was early ancient Italy. And then here are the assessments. So as a writing intensive class, the primary assignments were 2 papers and weekly journals. And really for the journals, they were designed to encourage students to better situate themselves in the discussion. And it was allowed kind of as a, it was given as a form of giving them an ability to process their thoughts and emotions as they encountered class material. For paper 1, the students were asked to reflect upon the history and experiences of local Indigenous communities in Maine, such as the Wabanaki peoples. And this was particularly important, perhaps because the focus of the class was on the Indigenous peoples of northwestern British Columbia and ancient Italy. Students were asked to compare the descriptions and experiences of the Wabanaki with Julius Caesar and Tacitus's characterizations of Gauls and Celts living in Western Europe. And since Bowdoin actually houses the archive for the Maine Wabanaki Child State Welfare Truth and Reconciliation Commission, students had really easy access to documents such as this TRC mandate, the Commissioner's Oath of Service, really any kind of government or state issued documents, as well as filmed and transcribed statements made by Indigenous survivors of the state welfare system. The second paper asked students to select 2 additional Indigenous communities to research, and then to identify a social issue which contributed to the erasure of Indigenous voices. Now, one community had to be located in either Canada or the United States, and the second community had to be in the broader ancient Mediterranean. So what I now want to do is look at each of the modules in a little more detail. So here's module 1, which, as I said, was introductory. So it involved defining key terms like indigeneity. It also required a brief kind of crash course on the methodology of classical studies and Roman history, as well as earlier scholarly approaches to classics and indigeneity. So we looked at some of the work conducted by Catherine Blouin and Craig Williams. And then, of course, we had Caitlin's guest lecture, which we'll be getting to very shortly. So next is module 2. known as the Highway of Tears. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with this topic, the Highway of Tears refers to a 450.5 mile or kind of 725-kilometer stretch of Highway 16, all the way from the city of Prince George in central British Columbia to the coastal city of Prince Rupert. Highway 16 is part of what's known as the Yellowhead Highway, which in turn is part of the Trans-Canada Highway. The Yellowhead, named for Indigenous Métis fur trader Pierre Bostonnet, nicknamed Tête Jaune for the blonde streaks in his hair, stretches from Winnipeg, Manitoba, all the way to Graham Island in British Columbia. So this is a vast area. The total number of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls remains unknown, both along Highway 16 and specifically the Highway of Tears and in Canada more broadly. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the RCMP, reports that around 1,017 Indigenous women were reported by friends and family as being killed between 1980 and 2012. Patty Haidu, the current Minister of Indigenous Services and a former Minister of Status of Women, has referred to research from the Native Women's Association of Canada, and that estimates that 4,000 women have been reported murdered within the same time period. When the Highway of Tears Symposium recommendation report was released in 2006, over 30 Indigenous women and girls had been reported missing and or murdered on the Highway of Tears, starting in around 1970. And as of October 2023, the toll now likely exceeds 40. Returning to Module 2, I actually chose to begin with the Highway of Tears rather than ancient Italy because the events are more recent and are documented in greater detail. Furthermore, unlike ancient Italy, where the majority of extant sources are written from the perspective of the Romans, there are numerous documentaries, books, articles, and other resources on the Highway of Tears, which give voice to the victims, their friends, and their families. This diversity of perspectives, including Indigenous-centered scholarship, helped students better understand theories of indigeneity and identify them in specific case studies. The classes addressed the Highway of Tears thematically rather than chronologically, really with the hope that my students would be able to easily identify parallels in the upcoming Ancient Italy module. As you can see, we started with statistics, namely how Indigenous women and girls are likely to be more likely to be victims of violent crimes than their non-Indigenous counterparts. And recent scholarship has listed multiple contributing factors which result in these higher rates of hitchhiking, such as stereotypes about Indigenous women, poverty, geographic dislocation, as well as lack of access to public resources and services. And next was an analysis of the system, quote unquote. Researchers have examined the impact of government-run institutions, such as the residential schools and child welfare system on Indigenous people, as well as tensions between these communities and law enforcement and the judicial system. And then finally, this module concluded with a discussion about plans for the future. So students read the Highway of Tears Symposium Recommendations report almost in its entirety, which was published in 2006. And that aimed to address the underlying socioeconomic causes of the Highway of Tears, as well as offered recommendations for the future. And they also explored the RCMP's project EPANA, which is a task force devoted to investigating several missing and murdered cases within the Highway of Tears corridor. Module 3, so the final module for this course, the final segment, centered on two Indigenous Italic peoples, the Etruscans and the Sabines, as well as their presence in early Roman history. The first few classes addressed inhabitants of the Latin region prior to Aeneas's arrival, and discussions focused on keywords from the readings, which some of the sources which I've listed above, such as the emphatically pre-Roman names for Italia, so Hesperia, Ausonia, kind of their significance. As well as the word Aborigines, right? We can all kind of hear the English derivatives there, referring to Latinus's people. And this was all through an Indigenous lens. The Etruscan unit focused on Roman interactions with Etruscan peoples. We began with Aeneas's encounter with Turnus and Mezentius, and then explored the reigns of the Etruscan kings, so Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus. And students were encouraged to pay particular attention to the language used to describe Tanaquil, Priscus's wife, and Tullia, Tullius's daughter, and Superbus's wife. And strictly with the purpose of identifying any parallels with the Highway of Tears module. Now, because of time constraints, I was unable to address the Roman-Etruscan wars, which ultimately resulted in the conquest of Rome in Etruria and the granting of citizenship in the late 3rd century. It was too much in one unit. The final third of Module 3 addressed the Sabines. After an overview, which included the story of Romulus and Remus, as well as an overview of the Sabine people, we analysed Livy's account of the rape of the Sabine women, which provided students with a clear example of forced assimilation. The remainder of the unit highlighted the eventually inextricable merging, if you will, of Sabine and Roman identities, demonstrating that the silencing and erasure of Indigenous voices is not always predicated on martial conquest and violence. And indeed, really, as we saw in this unit, sometimes it's more subtle. As students learned, this incorporation of the Sabine peoples and their culture into the Roman Republic resulted in a dominant Roman, if you will, identity. So we began with Rome's second king, the Sabine Numa Pompilius, who was credited with laying the foundations for Rome's state religion, while the final class examined descriptions of Cato the Elder, who was renowned for his exemplary character. And while many of his famous character traits, such as austerity, rusticity, gravitas, were all paradigms of Roman morality, a fragment from one of Cato's speeches credits their origin with his youth spent in the Sabine countryside. Okay, so before I hand things over to Caitlin, I would like to share some of the successes and challenges of teaching this course. So beginning with successes, broadly, I noticed a significant improvement in my students' writing. As the class progressed, their writing assignments reflected increased attention to detail and nuance, and I saw a real uptick in their confidence when it came to their arguments and evidence. But I think the biggest success, which does depend on where this class is offered, was taking students to visit related exhibits at Bowdoin's two museums, the Peary Macmillan Arctic Museum and the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. So as preparation for their second research paper, we visited the Arctic Museum to look at their collections of Indigenous, Alaskan, and Inuit art. And during our Etruscan unit, we spent a class in the art museum with one of my colleagues, Jim Higginbotham. And Jim gave us this incredibly detailed tour of an exhibition, which he had himself curated, titled Etruscan Gifts, Artifacts from Early Italy in the Bowdoin Collection. My students thoroughly enjoyed both excursions and really relished the opportunity to see some of these Indigenous communities, quote, come to life through these pieces of art. Now, of course, this class was not without its challenges. I really have to emphasize that we consistently encountered sensitive and difficult material. And as such, it was really important to make sure that both my students and I had plenty of time and space to process our thoughts and emotions. In addition to the assigned journal entries, which I mentioned earlier, I tried to be as flexible as possible, so students were allowed to leave their class whenever they felt overwhelmed, and I adjusted the pace of readings and lesson plans accordingly. I also observed several challenges for students specifically during the Ancient Italy unit. The first was the noticeable increase in contextual and assigned material. So because this class assumed no prior knowledge of classics, not everybody was familiar with ancient Roman history. And furthermore, because there are no extant contemporary sources on pre-Roman and early Italy, an initial overview of Roman history and Latin literature all the way up to the end of Trajan's reign was, I felt, very important, but it was a lot. The medley of assigned readings was another challenge. So unlike the readings from the Highway of Tears unit, which were predominantly derived from Matthew Smiley's documentary and Jessica McDiarmid's book, you can see, well, you saw on a previous slide that the ancient Italy model required a variety of sources. So students read passages from the source book, Early Rome, Myth and Society, edited and translated by Jacqueline Neal, and that contained a really great anthology of ancient primary sources and useful historical and literary context. But in addition to the textbook, I often assigned longer excerpts from Dionysius of Halicarnassus, from Livy, Virgil, Ovid, as well as fragments from the early Roman historian Cato the Elder. And the final challenge, particularly for students, I think, was the interpretation of these ancient texts. So in contrast with the Highway of Tears module, which contained material that addressed both Indigenous and non-Indigenous perspectives, there are very few extant sources produced by the Indigenous peoples who were forcibly assimilated into the Roman Republic. And additionally, because the historicity of ancient accounts is often dubious, students learned that they needed to rely on commentaries and reading between the lines in order to identify discussions of indigeneity in these ancient texts. Furthermore, while there are some clear parallels between ancient Rome and the Highway of Tears, such as the rape of the Sabine women and the MMIWG epidemic, or indeed the pejorative and stereotypical language used to describe indigenous peoples, Roman and contemporary conceptualizations of indigeneity, gender, sexuality, race, and ethnicity are not always equivalent. Okay, so now on to my co-presenter, Caitlin.
Say hello. First, I would like to thank Maya for first reaching out to me at the 2024 AIA SCS conference in Chicago and for asking me to guest lecture for her not once, but twice. I am incredibly grateful to have been able to share my perspectives and thoughts with Maya students and was really pleased to hear that they enjoyed my presentation and asked about me multiple times afterwards. The engagement of the class was wonderful. And there seemed to be genuine interest from the students. And I think that this is indicative of changing attitudes in classics and shows willingness to learn from scholars. My current research focuses on the use of classics within the framework of the Hudson's Bay Company and how it was directly and indirectly used as a tool of colonization in what is now Canada, specifically northern Manitoba. The title of my presentation is Colonization, Imperialism, and the Hudson's Bay Company, the Consequence of Classics on the Indigenous People of North America. I'll try to summarize this as briefly as possible. In the 18th and 19th centuries, British imperialism was reaching its peak in the New World. Operating on the territories of what is now collectively known as Canada, the Hudson's Bay Company was incorporated by English Royal Charter in 1670 and quickly came to dominate much of the English-controlled Hudson's Bay drainage basin. Rigorous studies in classics would have been at the center of any upper-class gentleman's schooling and undoubtedly would have influenced how he saw and interacted with the world around him. In his paper, Greece and Rome in the British Empire, Contrasting Role Models, Krishan Kumar points out that, quote, the classics were what they resorted to when they wished to draw lessons from the past, end quote. The company's first governor, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, was educated at the University of Leiden in The Hague, Netherlands. Although he was primarily schooled in mathematics and the sciences, he is said to have also taken great interest in politics and philosophy. There is no doubt that the core of Prince Rupert's education would have been classical studies. Succeeding governors were similarly educated and often looked to ancient sources for inspiration and guidance in daily life. In fact, the Latin phrase, Historia Magistra Vitae, paraphrased from Roman orator Cicero's De Oratore, embodies history as a teacher of life. With this in mind, I argue that the colonization and subsequent genocide of the indigenous peoples of North America are ultimately a consequence of classics. It is clear that there are vestiges of Roman imperialism within the framework of the Hudson's Bay Company, all of which have passed through and been perpetuated by the minds of wealthy white European men. In 1741, David Hume expressed in his essay of the study of history, quote, an unpardonable ignorance in persons of whatever sex or condition, not to be acquainted with the history of their own country, together with the histories of ancient Greece and Rome, end quote. Ancient authors who commended expansionism and imperialism regularly referenced the use of mass violence and destruction as tools necessary to conquer others. In turn, I argue that a classical education, intimate knowledge of ancient source material, and philosophy have both directly and indirectly driven and influenced modern stances on colonization, specifically within the Hudson's Bay Company and its interactions with the indigenous peoples of North America. Why? There are a few reasons why I have chosen this topic. First, there's the obvious absence of scholarship on classical reception and classical studies relating to the indigenous people of North America. More important, I think, is the notable underrepresentation of indigenous scholars in the field of classics. Historically, indigenous people have been excluded from spaces of study and certainly were not welcomed in a discipline populated by wealthy white men. Even more important still is the fact that I'm a classicist and I'm indigenous. My ancestors would almost certainly have been some of the first people that the Hudson's Bay Company interacted with along the Nelson and Churchill rivers in northern Manitoba. Although the Hudson's Bay Company was by no means a colonial enterprise in the beginning, nor was it ever meant to be, classical ideals and philosophies were so entrenched in the minds and culture of its founders that it paved the way for a genocide against Indigenous people that is still not resolved today. Quote, "At first, Hudson's Bay Company might seem irrelevant to the history of how the Dominion of Canada treated Indians. But if Canada inherited its early Indian relations from colonial predecessors, the Hudson's Bay Company is pertinent because Hudson's Bay was one of Canada's colonial predecessors." This quote comes from John Donne's History of the Oregon Territory and British North American Fur Trade, with an account of the habits and customs of the principal native tribes on the northern continent, written in 1844. Next, I introduce the earliest proprietors and investors of the Hudson's Bay Company. I have, to the best of my abilities, looked into the educational backgrounds and upbringings of the men listed as the company's first investors and committee members. All of these men were part of the King's inner circle, and many were experienced in colonial administration, had substantial governmental influence, or frankly, simply had enough money and interest to hold a significant amount of stock in the company. Many of them also had significant ties to the slave trade. To that end, we can be almost certain that each of them would have been brought up with an education that was rooted in classical subjects. Kumar notes that, quote, "For all educated Europeans right up until the 19th century and beyond, the Greek and Latin classics remained the backbone of their thought. They all had at least a smattering of Latin, if not Greek. They, the classics, provided the basic principles of politics and a host of saws and maxims for everyday life. For the purposes of both private and public discourse among the educated classes, familiarity with classical writers was assumed, especially the Latin writers, Lucretius, Sallust, Virgil, Ovid, Livy, Horace, Tacitus, Terence, and Juvenal," end quote. Other points that I speak more in depth about are the inclusion of res nullius, terra nullius, the doctrine of discovery, and classical rhetoric in the company's charter, as well as the company's Latin motto and its multiple implied meanings. As an Indigenous woman in classics, I feel very strongly about the need for resources, such as courses like this one, that seek to educate from an Indigenous perspective. Having a foot in two very different worlds has shown me that scholars in classics still have a lot to learn about the damage that has been done and that is still being done through the justification of a classical lens. History has always been recorded by the victor, or in this case, the colonizer, and unfortunately, it has been no different in North America. In the post-colonial world, Indigenous people have continuously had their voices silenced and discredited, and their stories left untold. The same can be said for Indigenous groups such as the Sabines, Etruscans, and Samnites in antiquity. Having been considered the core of education for hundreds of years, classical studies have inadvertently shaped the way people, men, viewed themselves, others, and their relation to the world around them. Less than 150 years have passed since classical studies were removed from most school curriculums, yet many still choose sources and narratives from the classical world to inspire, guide, or even justify their actions. I think that the field of classics can benefit greatly from the incorporation of Indigenous voices and scholarship to an extent. I say this because Indigenous voices are too often exploited and unrewarded under the guise of education and reconciliation. In order for academia, not just classics, to collaborate with Indigenous people, scholars or not, they must understand that it is not our duty to educate, and that adequate compensation is an expectation for knowledge shared. There must also be an understanding and acceptance of learning and teaching methods not considered conventional by academia's standards. The inclusion of Indigenous voices in academic settings is still incredibly important and should be supported and facilitated at every opportunity, so long as there's a willingness from scholars to learn and ultimately to change. The colonization of Indigenous peoples has occurred repeatedly throughout history. I think it is necessary to be clear that even though some of these events occurred in antiquity, the passage of time does not lessen the validity or gravity of such experiences. The voices and stories of the Sabine women, the Etruscans, Samnites, and many others were systematically silenced by the oppressor in an effort to erase their culture and legacy completely. The parallels to contemporary accounts of colonization in North America are clear and undeniable, from the language used by the colonizer to describe Indigenous people to the use of outright violence as a method of control. Today, we have an opportunity to do these people justice by allowing Indigenous people to tell their side of the story and to simply listen to what they have to say. This course, I think, represents an important step forward in reconciliatory efforts within classics and academia as a whole. I'll end with this. Being a classicist does not consist solely of studying the ancient world. If you are to study classics, you must be able to understand and acknowledge the narratives and ideals that have been utilized directly and indirectly by colonizing entities against Indigenous people across the globe. Thank you.